Sometimes the hardest person to let go of is not the person you are still with. It is the person who is already gone. Sit with that for a moment, because it does not make sense at first. Logically, letting go of someone who is present, someone who occupies your daily life, someone you have to see and speak to and negotiate with, that should be the harder task. Letting go of someone who has already left should be easier. There is nothing left to negotiate. There is no one in the room to disagree with you. The decision, in some sense, has already been made, by them, by circumstance, by time, and yet, the relationship ended weeks ago, maybe longer. You know it ended. You may even know, somewhere quiet and honest inside you, that it needed to end. You have told your friends you are fine. You have told yourself you are moving on. You have deleted the photos, or you meant to, or you moved them to a folder you tell yourself you will delete later. And still, somehow, your mind keeps reopening the case. You remember something they said, an offhand comment from 8 months ago, and it arrives uninvited while you are making coffee. You replay one conversation, not even a significant one. Sometimes it is the ordinary ones that return the most. Turning it over, searching it for a clue you missed. You imagine what would happen if they suddenly texted. You compose the reply in your head before there is anything to reply to. You check your phone even when you know, with total certainty, that there will be nothing there. You see something that reminds you of them. A street, a song, a stranger with the same walk. And for a few seconds, your whole nervous system behaves as though the loss is happening again, fresh, for the first time. Why does the mind keep holding on to something reality has already taken away? It is tempting to answer this with a simple story. You love them, therefore you miss them, therefore this is what love costs. And there is truth in that. But it does not fully explain the specific, repetitive, almost involuntary quality of this kind of holding on. It does not explain why the mind returns to the wound on its own schedule, without your permission, long after the facts have been settled. So here is another possibility. Not a replacement for the first one, but a layer underneath it. Perhaps the problem is not that you love too much. Perhaps the problem is that part of you is still arguing with reality. You are not only missing the person, you are, in a quiet and mostly unconscious way, fighting the fact that they are no longer where you want them to be. You are relitigating something that has already been decided. And that distinction between missing someone and arguing with the fact of their absence changes almost everything about how this pain works, and almost everything about what you can actually do with it. More than 2,000 years ago, a strange and demanding school of philosophy kept returning to a version of this same difficult idea. The Stoics, thinkers like Epictetus, a man who had been enslaved before he taught philosophy to some of the most powerful people in Rome, Seneca, a statesman who wrote his most searching work while facing exile and, later, his own death, and Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who kept a private journal reminding himself, night after night, of the same handful of truths he could not seem to fully absorb. All of them circled the same claim. You can care deeply about something without making your peace dependent upon possessing it. I am not going to unpack that fully yet, because if I do, it will sound like a slogan, and slogans are easy to agree with and impossible to live. Instead, let's sit in the discomfort of it for a moment, because the discomfort is the point. Intellectually, the idea sounds reasonable, almost obvious even. Of course, peace shouldn't depend on possessing things. We know, in the abstract, that people are not objects we can own, that outcomes are not guaranteed, that nothing external is fully within our control. Emotionally, it can feel almost impossible. If you loved someone, how are you supposed to simply accept that they are gone? If you wanted a future with someone, a specific one, with a shape and a texture you had already started living inside, in your imagination, How do you stop imagining that future? If someone mattered to you, doesn't letting go feel like a kind of betrayal, an admission that they no longer matter, that the whole thing meant less than you thought? This is where most advice about moving on fails. It asks you to stop caring in order to stop hurting, as though the only way out of attachment is through indifference. It asks you to perform a kind of forgetting that does not actually happen, and when it doesn't happen, it leaves you feeling like you are failing at grief on top of already grieving. So here is the deeper question this entire audiobook is going to sit with, turn over, and slowly answer from many different angles. What if letting go does not require you to stop caring? What if it requires you to stop trying to make reality obey your attachment? Those are not the same demand. One asks you to erase something. The other asks you to stop fighting something that has already happened. And the difference between those two tasks, erasing versus ceasing to fight, is, I think, the entire difference between a grief that eventually settles into peace and a grief that calcifies into years of quiet suffering. We are not going to resolve that question yet. We're going to let it sit, slightly open, the way the Stoics let their hardest questions sit, not as puzzles to be solved in a single clever sentence, but as ongoing practices, revisited daily, understood a little more deeply each time. Because there are more questions underneath this one. Why can someone be physically absent but psychologically present every single day, sometimes more present than people who are actually in the room with you? Why does the mind replay conversations long after they are finished, as if rehearsal could somehow change the outcome? Why do we sometimes miss people more once we know, with certainty, that we cannot have them? Why does uncertainty seem to make attachment stronger rather than weaker? Why does checking someone's social media make the ache worse, even when we already know, before we open the app, that it will? Why does the mind keep constructing alternate versions of the relationship? The one where you said the right thing, the one where they stayed, the one where it all turned out differently. Why is acceptance so often confused with giving up, when in practice they may be almost opposites? Why does trying desperately not to think about someone sometimes guarantee that you think about them more? Why did the Stoics believe that suffering begins the moment we confuse what is ours to control with what never was? And why can remembering someone peacefully be a sign of healing, while trying to erase them entirely is often a sign that the wound is still open? Every one of these questions will be answered, not quickly and not with a single tidy formula, because that is not how this kind of understanding works. But by the end, I want you to have something more useful than comfort. I want you to have a way of seeing your own mind clearly enough that you can finally stop asking it to do the impossible. Let's begin with the strangest and most useful idea the Stoics ever developed, a way of dividing the entire world into exactly two categories. And let's find out what happens when you apply it, honestly, to the person you cannot stop thinking about. There is an exercise Epictetus taught his students, and it begins with a division so simple it almost sounds like nothing. He said, "Some things are up to us, and some things are not." That's the whole idea in its rawest form, but like most simple ideas, its power is entirely in the application, and most people, then and now, apply it badly. If they apply it at all, let's apply it here, specifically to the person you cannot stop thinking about. You cannot control whether someone loves you. You can be lovable. You can be devoted. You can be exactly the person a healthy relationship needs. And someone can still, for reasons that may have nothing to do with your worth, stop loving you, or love someone else more, or simply change. You cannot control whether someone stays. Staying is a choice made new each day by another mind, one you do not have access to and never fully will. You cannot control whether someone changes into someone kinder, someone more ready, Someone who finally becomes the version of themselves you always believed was in there. That transformation, if it happens on its own timeline, driven by its own causes, most of which have nothing to do with you. You cannot control whether someone chooses you. Not this time, and not if there is a next time. You cannot control whether someone understands you, truly understands, the way you have always wanted to be understood, in the particular language of your particular pain. You cannot control whether someone regrets leaving. You cannot control whether someone comes back. You cannot control whether the past happened differently. This one deserves a pause, because so much of what keeps a person stuck is a silent campaign to revise history, to find the sentence, the moment, the version of events in which it all went another way. But there is no version. There is only what happened. You cannot control whether another person gives you closure, the explanation, the apology, the acknowledgement that would finally let you exhale. Read that list again, slowly, and notice something uncomfortable. Almost everything that hurts about this situation is on it. Almost the entire engine of your suffering is running on things that were never yours to operate in the first place. You have been, in effect, trying to steer a car from the passenger seat, pulling an imaginary wheel, pressing an imaginary brake, and feeling a very real despair every time the car doesn't respond. This is not a moral failing. It is not a sign of weakness or excessive love. It is simply what an untrained mind does, because an untrained mind does not naturally distinguish between what is inside its power and what only feels like it should be, because it matters so much. So what, then, is actually yours? You can influence how you interpret what happened, not by pretending it didn't hurt, but by choosing which story you tell yourself about what it means. You can influence what you repeatedly expose yourself to, the photos you keep open, the profile you keep checking, the songs you keep replaying at the exact moment they will hurt the most. You can influence what you choose to remember, and how, not falsifying the past, but deciding whether you rehearse only its wounds or allow its whole texture, the good moments included, to exist without being weaponized against your own healing. You can influence whether you keep checking, and what you do in the 60 seconds after the urge to check arrives. You can influence whether you continue feeding the fantasy, the imagined reunion, the imagined apology, the imagined version of them that only exists because the real, complicated, flawed person is no longer available to correct it. You can influence how you speak to yourself in the moments the ache arrives. Whether the internal voice says, "Something is wrong with me for still feeling this," or whether it says, "This is what grief feels like, and it is allowed to be here." You can influence what you do with your attention, hour by hour, which is really another way of saying you can influence what you do with your life, because attention is the material life is built from. And you can influence what kind of life you build in the space the relationship used to occupy. Notice the shape of this second list. None of it makes the loss stop hurting. None of it guarantees the ache disappears by next Tuesday. That was never the promise, and any framework that promises otherwise is selling you something that doesn't exist. What this list offers instead is smaller and, over time, far more powerful. It hands you back the only territory you ever actually owned. Not the other person, not their choices, not the outcome. Just this, your attention, your interpretation, your next action. Here is the scenario. It's late. You've had a fine day, nothing remarkable. And then you lie down and your mind, with nothing left to distract it, goes looking for the one place it knows will produce a feeling, any feeling, strong enough to hold its attention. It goes to them. It replays the ending. It drafts the message you'll never send. It runs the alternate timeline where you said the thing you didn't say, and in that timeline they stay. In that moment, ask yourself one very specific question the same question every time. What here is actually mine to work with? Not, will they come back? Not, do they think about me too? Not, was I enough? Those questions have no flaw. You can ask them forever and never reach an answer solid enough to stand on, because the answer lives inside someone else's mind, a place you were never going to be able to enter, no matter how many nights you spent trying. Instead, what am I doing right now with the fact that they are not here? That single reframing from "fref, how do I change what happened?" to "what will I do with what happened?" is not a trick, and it will not feel like relief the first 50 times you use it. It will feel, honestly, a little unsatisfying, because it does not give the mind the dramatic resolution it is craving. There is no scene where they realize what they lost. There is no vindication. There is only you tonight, deciding again what to do with your own attention. But this is precisely where the Stoics located freedom, not in controlling outcomes. They were unusually honest about how little of that is available to any of us, but in recognizing, with total clarity, the one instrument that never leaves your hands: your own judgment, your own next choice. We will come back to this distinction again and again throughout this audiobook, because understanding it once is not the same as living inside it. It is a practice, not a fact you memorize. But for now, hold on to the shape of it, because it is about to help explain something stranger. The thing you are actually holding on to when you say, "You can't let someone go." Here is a sentence you may have said to a friend, or to yourself, more than once since this ended. "I can't let go because I still love them." It sounds true. It feels true, and there is likely real love in it somewhere. But sit with it a little longer, and a different, more precise sentence starts to emerge underneath. You may not be holding on to the person. You may be holding on to the possibility that they might return, the possibility that they might change, that the very thing you needed them to become, they will finally become, just not in time for you to benefit from it, or perhaps, in the fantasy, just in time. The possibility that the story could still resolve into the ending you wanted, rather than the one you got. The possibility that one more conversation, the right one, the one you haven't had yet, could fix everything that went wrong. The possibility that the version of them you remember, patient, at their best, looking at you the way they looked at you in the beginning, could somehow become real again, permanently, if only the conditions lined up. This is a crucial distinction, so let's make it as concrete as possible with a scenario. Picture someone who was ghosted. No fight, no explanation, no closing conversation, just silence arriving without warning and never explained. Months later, they are still checking whether the person has viewed their story, still composing and deleting messages they don't send, still, on some nights, constructing an explanation generous enough to make the silence make sense. Maybe they're going through something. Maybe they'll reach out when they're ready. Maybe this isn't really the ending it looks like. Is this person in love with who ghosted them? Possibly, but look closer, and you'll often find something else running underneath the love and unfinished narrative. A story with no ending, and a mind that cannot tolerate an open loop, so it keeps generating candidate endings, checking each one against reality, hoping one of them will finally resolve. This is why closure feels so urgent in situations like this, not because the person misses the individual more than someone who had a clean, explained ending, but because the story itself has nowhere to rest. The attachment isn't only to the human being, it's to the unfinished sentence. This matters because it means the object of your longing may be partly imaginary, not fake, not invented from nothing, but assembled. A composite of the real person, the best version of the real person, and the version of the future you had already, quietly, started living inside before it was taken away. That future had a shape. Maybe it included a home you'd pictured, a version of yourself who was chosen and safe, a specific way of being known that you had started to rely on. When the relationship ended, you didn't just lose a person, you lost a projected timeline, one that, until very recently, felt as real and as solid as any timeline you were actually living. Grieving a person is disorienting enough. Grieving a future that never technically existed is stranger, because there is no ceremony for it, no accepted way to mourn something that was only ever a possibility. This is where attachment becomes especially difficult to work with, because it is no longer attached only to a person, someone with a name, a voice, a set of real and flawed qualities you could, in principle, evaluate honestly. It has become attached to an imagined future, which is infinitely more flexible, infinitely more forgiving, and infinitely more available to your imagination than the real, complicated person ever was. The imagined future never argues with you. It never has a bad day. It never chooses someone else. It is, in every sense, easier to love than reality, which is exactly why it is so hard to release. The Stoics were unusually alert to this particular trap. Though they didn't describe it in terms of breakups, they described it as the difference between what is given, the actual, present facts of a situation, and what is supplied by the mind, the interpretations, projections, and stories layered on top of those facts. Marcus Aurelius returned to a version of this constantly in his private notebook, reminding himself, again and again, to strip an experience down to what is actually happening, without the additional narrative his mind kept trying to attach to it, not because the narrative is always wrong, but because it is rarely, if ever, examined honestly while grief is active. So here is a question worth sitting with, uncomfortable as it may be. What, exactly, are you missing? Is it the person, as they actually were, inconsistent, sometimes distant, capable of hurting you in the specific ways they did? Or is it the possibility, the version of them at their best, extended indefinitely into a future that was never guaranteed to arrive, even if the relationship had continued? This is not a question designed to make you feel foolish for hoping. Hope is not the enemy here, but hope that has quietly detached from reality and started running entirely on its own fuel. That is a different animal, and it is worth being able to tell the two apart, because only one of them is something you can work with honestly. We are going to keep circling this distinction throughout the rest of this audiobook, from several different directions, because it sits underneath almost everything else we're going to discuss. But for now, simply notice it. The next time the ache arrives, ask, quietly, without judgment, am I missing them, or am I missing what I thought was going to happen? The answer might surprise you, and even if it doesn't, the question itself begins to do something useful. It starts separating the real from the imagined, which is precisely where the Stoics believed all clear thinking has to begin. Before we go further, it's worth clearing up a misunderstanding, because it will quietly sabotage everything else in this audiobook if it isn't addressed directly. Stoicism has a reputation, especially now, for a kind of emotional armor, gritted teeth, suppressed feeling, the stiff upper lip philosophy of men who refuse to cry. That reputation is not entirely undeserved by the popular version of the philosophy that circulates today, but it badly misrepresents the actual thinkers the tradition is built on. Seneca wrote letters to grieving friends that are tender almost to the point of being uncomfortable to read, full of genuine ache for people he had lost. Epictetus, who had lived through the literal loss of his own freedom, taught a philosophy aimed not at numbness, but at a very specific, very practical kind of peace, one available even to a person who had already lost almost everything that could be taken from him. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire during plague and war, wrote a private journal not to perform strength for anyone else, but because he was, by his own account, still struggling, still needing to remind himself of the same truths over and over, because knowing something once is not the same as being free of it. None of them needed you to become cold. What they were after was something more precise, and honestly more difficult, the ability to value something completely, without believing that value entitles you to keep it forever. This is worth repeating, because it is the entire philosophical spine of everything we're going to explore. You can value something without believing you are entitled to keep it. Consider how the Stoics thought about impermanence in general, not just in relationships. Everything changes. People change, not just in dramatic, visible ways, but constantly, in the small accumulating shifts of mood, circumstance, and growth that happen to every human being across a lifetime. Relationships change, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once. Circumstances change, bodies change, aging in ways that are entirely outside anyone's control. Roles change. The parent becomes the one who is cared for. The student becomes the teacher. The person who needed you no longer does. Seasons change, obviously, predictably, and yet we are still, every year, faintly surprised by winter. The Stoics believed, and this is the part that tends to get lost in the popularized, watered-down version of the philosophy, that suffering isn't caused by change itself. Change is simply how reality operates. It was never optional, and no amount of resistance has ever once stopped it. Suffering is caused by the attempt to make temporary things permanent, by quietly, often unconsciously expecting a person, a relationship, a stage of life to hold still, simply because we have grown attached to how it currently feels. This is not a small idea, and it is not, despite how it sounds when compressed into a single sentence, an argument for indifference. The goal was never to feel less. The goal was freedom from a very specific and very exhausting demand, the demand that something remain exactly as you wish it to remain, indefinitely, simply because you wish it. Think about what that demand actually requires of you. If you look at it honestly, it requires the entire world, including other autonomous, complicated, changing human beings, to organize itself around your preference. Stated that plainly, it sounds almost absurd, and yet it is the quiet, unspoken demand underneath so much of ordinary heartbreak. Please don't change. Please stay who you were when I fell for you. Please don't become someone who doesn't want this anymore. And no one states it that directly, of course. It shows up instead as anger, as bargaining, as the endless replaying of what if, as the refusal to update your internal picture of the relationship even months after it has ended. But underneath all of those, there is often this same quiet, impossible request being made of reality stay the same, for me. The Stoic response to this is neither cold nor cruel. It goes something like this: it happened. Now what will you do with what happened? That is not a dismissal of your pain. It is, if anything, the opposite, a refusal to let your pain be wasted on a fight that cannot be won. You are allowed to wish it had gone differently. The Stoics never asked anyone to pretend they didn't. What they asked, again and again, in letter after letter, journal entry after journal entry, was simpler and, in its own way, more demanding, having wished it, having grieved it. Are you now willing to work with what is actually true, rather than what you wanted to be true? This is the frame we're going to keep returning to throughout everything that follows. Not stop caring, not get over it, not you never needed them anyway, which is usually a lie people tell themselves to survive the first few weeks and rarely holds up under honest examination. Just this, quieter and far more sustainable: I cared, I still care, and I am no longer going to make my peace conditional on something I cannot control. Hold that sentence. We are going to need it again soon, when we look at exactly how the mind manufactures suffering out of ordinary pain, a process the Stoics described with a very specific and very useful image. There is an old image, not originally Stoic, but one the Stoics would have recognized immediately because it describes exactly the distinction they spent their lives trying to teach. Imagine being struck by an arrow. It hurts. Sharply, immediately, unavoidably. That is the first arrow, and there is no philosophy on earth that removes it. Loss hurts. Rejection hurts. The end of something you wanted to continue hurts. And it is supposed to. Nothing in this audiobook is going to ask you to feel less pain than the situation actually warrants. But then, in the same moment, very often, a second arrow follows the first, and this one, crucially, we fire ourselves. It is the story we add on top of the wound. They shouldn't have left. They should have chosen me. They should understand what they did to me. I should have said something different, something that would have changed the outcome. Maybe they'll come back. Maybe if I just wait long enough, or say the right thing, they'll finally realize. What if I had done this differently? What if none of this had to happen at all? Notice that none of these thoughts are the original pain. They are commentary on the pain, generated after the fact, and this is the important part, capable of being fired again and again, indefinitely, long after the first arrow has already landed and the wound has already begun, on its own, to heal. This is the mechanism worth understanding clearly, because it explains something that otherwise feels mysterious. Why the pain of a breakup doesn't fade in a straight line. Why you can feel almost fine for 2 days and then, without any new event triggering it, you feel as raw as you did in week 1. It's rarely because the original wound reopened on its own. It's because a second arrow was fired, a thought, a memory rehearsed instead of simply remembered, a what if allowed to spiral instead of noticed and released. The first arrow, the Stoics would say, may be largely outside your control. You did not choose to be left. You did not choose for the relationship to end the way it did. That pain is close to unavoidable, and there is no use pretending otherwise. The second arrow is different. It is, at least partially, something you have a hand in. Not in the sense that you're choosing it consciously, in the moment, the way you'd choose what to have for dinner, but in the sense that it is a habit, a groove worn into the mind by repetition, and grooves like that can, with real effort and real practice, be worn down and eventually replaced by different ones. Here's the scenario. You're doing fine, genuinely fine, not performing fine, and then a thought arrives. They should have fought for this. It feels, in the moment, like an observation, a simple statement of fact. But look closer, and you'll see it's actually a demand dressed up as a thought. A demand that the past have gone differently, a demand that another person's choices had been other than they were. And because it's a demand the universe has no obligation to honor, entertaining it doesn't produce clarity. It produces a fresh wave of exactly the pain you were finally starting to move past. This is not a call to suppress the thought the moment it arrives, forcing it down with sheer willpower. That approach tends to backfire, giving the thought more power, not less, the same way trying desperately not to think about something almost guarantees you'll think about it more. The alternative the Stoics practiced was subtler. Notice the thought, recognize it for what it is. A story, not a fact, a second arrow, not the original wound. And then, gently, without drama, choose not to follow it any further, not fight it, not argue with it, just decline the invitation it's extending. Over time, this becomes less effortful. Not because the thoughts stop arriving entirely. They may always arrive, at least occasionally, for longer than you'd like. But because your relationship to them changes. You stop treating every one of them as an emergency requiring your full participation. You start recognizing them, almost as soon as they appear, as familiar visitors rather than urgent new information. The distinction this builds toward is one you're going to need for the rest of this audiobook, the difference between experiencing grief and repeatedly feeding the story around grief. Grief, the first arrow, is something that happens to you, and it deserves space, patience, and honesty. The story, the second arrow, fired over and over by a mind trying to resolve something it cannot resolve, is something you can learn slowly and imperfectly to stop supplying the ammunition for. This is not about becoming someone who doesn't feel the loss. It is about becoming someone who can tell the difference between the wound and the reopening of the wound, and who, increasingly, chooses not to be the one holding the bow. It can be useful at this point to step back from philosophy for a moment and ask a more mechanical question. Why does the mind fixate on this person, specifically, with this much intensity? Because understanding the machinery underneath attachment doesn't dissolve the feeling, but it does something almost as valuable. It removes the layer of shame that so often gets added on top of it. The quiet belief that you are somehow doing grief wrong, or feeling too much, or taking too long. Consider uncertainty first, because it may be the single strongest ingredient in the whole mixture. A clean, fully explained ending is painful, but it is at least stable. The mind can eventually file it away, because there is nothing left unresolved. An ending with no clear explanation, or one that leaves the door even slightly ajar, is different. The mind treats open questions the way it treats unfinished tasks. It keeps returning to them, again and again, not because it enjoys the pain, but because uncertainty itself functions, almost like an alarm the brain cannot fully silence. This connects to something researchers call intermittent reinforcement, the psychological pattern where a reward that arrives unpredictably is far more compelling and far more addictive than one that arrives reliably. A relationship with inconsistent affection, with moments of closeness followed by withdrawal, followed again by closeness, trains the mind more powerfully than steady affection ever could. For the same reason a slot machine is more compelling than a vending machine. If the relationship you're grieving had this quality, hot and cold, close and distant, unpredictable, that alone can explain a significant amount of why the attachment feels so hard to shake, independent of how healthy or unhealthy the relationship actually was. Memory plays its own trick. The mind does not store experience like a video recording, evenly, moment by moment. It stores emotional peaks far more vividly than it stores the ordinary, unremarkable stretches in between. This means your memory of the relationship is, almost by construction, weighted toward its most intense moments, both the best ones and, sometimes, the worst, while the long, unremarkable Tuesday evenings that made up most of the actual relationship fade into the background. This is part of why time apart can paradoxically intensify longing rather than reduce it. The ordinary texture fades first, leaving behind a concentrated residue of the highlights. Idealization follows naturally from this. Once someone is gone, there is no longer a real, present, occasionally irritating human being available to correct the story your memory is telling. The version of them that remains in your mind is free to become smoother, kinder, and more perfectly suited to you than the actual person ever was. Not because you're lying to yourself on purpose, but because absence removes the friction that used to keep the picture honest. Habit matters more than people usually credit. A relationship is not only an emotional bond, it's also a structure, a set of routines, check-ins, shared rituals, a particular shape to your days. When that structure disappears, the mind experiences something closer to withdrawal than simple sadness, because it has lost not just a person, but a pattern it had come to rely on, often without ever noticing how much it had come to rely on it. Loneliness distorts the picture further, and in a specific direction. It tends to make the lost person seem more irreplaceable than they may actually have been, because loneliness narrows the mind's sense of what's possible. In the middle of loneliness it can feel, not as a conscious belief, but as a felt sense, as though this person was the only road to the kind of connection you're now missing, even when that isn't objectively true. And then there's the matter of unfinished narrative, which we touched on earlier. A story without an ending is cognitively uncomfortable in a very specific way. The mind keeps returning to it, the way it returns to an open tab it forgot to close. Not because the content is especially urgent, but because the incompleteness itself generates a kind of low-grade pressure. None of these mechanisms mean something is wrong with you. They mean you are a human brain doing exactly what human brains have always done with loss, uncertainty, and memory. Feeling this strongly is not a symptom. It is evidence that something mattered. But here is the distinction that actually matters, practically. Going forward, understanding why attachment feels strong is not the same as being obligated to act on every impulse it generates. You can recognize, with real compassion for yourself, of course I want to check their profile. Uncertainty always pulls the mind back toward the last place it had information. And, in the very same breath, choose not to check. Understanding the mechanism gives you distance from it. It turns an experience that felt like fate. I can't help it, I just miss them so much, into something closer to whether you can recognize, prepare for, and eventually, with practice, ride out without being swept away by it every single time. There is a quieter, more uncomfortable exercise worth doing at this point, and it requires a kind of honesty that grief doesn't always make easy. It's the difference between the actual person and the story you constructed around them. This is not an invitation to decide the relationship was secretly toxic, or that they never really cared, or any of the other narratives people sometimes reach for, because they're less painful than the plain truth. That kind of rewriting is just another form of the second arrow. A story fired to manage pain, rather than to see clearly. The goal here is not to make the person smaller. It's to make the picture accurate. So, gently ask who were they actually. Not who you hoped they'd become. Not who they were in the 6 best weeks of the relationship. Who were they, consistently, across the whole span of time you knew them? What did they consistently do? Not once, not in a single grand gesture, but as a pattern, week after week. How did you actually feel around them on an ordinary Tuesday, not on an anniversary or a vacation? What was real, meaning? What happened, verifiably in the world, as opposed to what you inferred, hoped, or filled in yourself? What did you hope would change about them, and had it, in fact, been changing? Or had you been waiting for a change that had never once, in all your time together, actually shown signs of arriving? What did you imagine they could become, if given enough time, enough patience, enough of your effort? And which parts of the relationship, if you're honest, existed only in potential? In the future you were building in your head, rather than in the present you were actually living. This section is not meant to insult anyone, including you, for having hoped. Hope is not naive. It's part of how relationships survive their difficult stretches. But hope has a shadow side, which is the quiet substitution of a person's potential for their actual, demonstrated pattern of behavior, and grief has a way of making that substitution permanent, freezing the potential in place forever, long after any realistic chance of it arriving has passed. Reality, in its full form, deserves to be remembered accurately. The good, genuinely. The moments that were real, that mattered, that you're allowed to keep without apology. The bad. The specific ways this person hurt you, disappointed you, or fell short of what you needed, which grief has a way of quietly editing out once idealization sets in. The ordinary, the unremarkable, undramatic stretches that made up most of the relationship's actual runtime, and that tend to be the first thing forgotten. The uncomfortable, the parts you'd rather not examine too closely, because they complicate the clean story you'd prefer to tell yourself, whether that story casts them as a villain or a saint. The things you miss, honestly. The things you don't miss, even if you feel guilty admitting it. The things you wanted from them. And, separately. Because these are not always the same list. The things they actually, demonstrably gave. This exercise does something quietly important. It starts to loosen the grip of the imagined, idealized version of the relationship, the one built partly from memory and partly from longing, and replaces it with something sturdier. A full, textured, honest picture that includes disappointment as well as beauty. That picture is harder to romanticize, which sounds like a loss, but it's actually a form of relief because it becomes something you can finally set down. You cannot easily let go of a fantasy because a fantasy has no weight, no edges, nothing to release your grip from. You can let go of a full, real, complicated truth because a truth, unlike a fantasy, is something you can finally finish carrying. The Stoics had a particular way of thinking about everything external to us. Possession, status, health, and yes, other people. That can sound harsh on first hearing, but reveals something quite different once you sit with it. They believed that nothing outside your own judgment and will is ultimately, permanently yours to possess. Not your body, in the end, not your position in the world, and certainly not another person, however deeply you love them. It is tempting to hear this as, people don't matter. But that is precisely backwards from what the Stoics were arguing, and it's worth being exact about the difference, because the whole framework collapses if you get this part wrong. People matter precisely because they are temporary. Think about what permanence would actually do to meaning if you follow it honestly. If a person, or a relationship, or any experience were simply guaranteed, permanent, incapable of ever being lost, it would lose the very quality that makes us treasure it in the first place. We do not cherish sunsets because they last forever. We cherish them, in part, because they don't. The fact that something can be lost does not make it meaningless. Its impermanence is part of its reality, not an unfortunate flaw in an otherwise perfect arrangement, but simply what it means to love something that exists in time. A relationship can be deeply valuable without being permanent. A person can change your life, genuinely, irreversibly, for the better, without remaining in it forever. A chapter can be meaningful without becoming the entire book. This is the refrain worth returning to, again and again. Whenever the mind starts treating the relationships, ending as evidence that it didn't matter, or wasn't real, or was somehow a waste. It was not a waste simply because it ended. Almost nothing valuable in a human life is permanent. Not friendships, not careers, not even, eventually, the people we love the most in the world. If impermanence disqualified something from mattering, then nothing would matter, because everything, without exception, eventually changes or ends. There is a hidden demand buried inside a lot of ordinary heartbreak, and it's worth naming it plainly, because it rarely announces itself directly. Please don't change. Please stay who you were when this was good. Please don't become someone who doesn't want me. But life is not built to honor that request. Life is change, continuously, in every direction, whether we consent to it or not. People leave. People grow, sometimes toward us and sometimes away from us. People become different. Not necessarily worse, just different, shaped by experiences we weren't there for. Sometimes people return. Sometimes they don't. And there's no way to know in advance which kind of ending you're living through. Sometimes relationships end because someone did something clearly, identifiably wrong. More often, they end because two people simply became incompatible, not villains and victims. Just two lives that no longer moved in the same direction. And sometimes, hardest of all, there is no satisfying explanation, no clean narrative, no answer that, once received, would actually have made this easier. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is not a specific painful fact, but the absence of any explanation solid enough to close the question permanently. The Stoic response to all of this is not, "It doesn't matter. It never was." The response is, "Happened. Now what will I do with what happened?" That sentence does not erase the loss. It simply refuses to let the loss become the entire remaining shape of your life. It takes the fact of what occurred, unchangeable, final, already written, and turns your attention toward the one part of the story that is, in fact, still being written, everything that comes next. Somewhere in most stories like this, there is a fantasy about one final piece of information, the unanswered message finally answered, the missing explanation finally given, the apology that never came finally arriving, the conversation you never got to have finally happening, exactly the way you've rehearsed it. This fantasy tends to feel less like a wish and more like a requirement, as though your ability to move forward is genuinely contingent on it. It is worth examining this fantasy closely, because it usually promises more than it could ever deliver, even in the unlikely event it came true. Imagine for a moment that it did happen. They reached out. They explained everything fully, honestly, with no gaps left unfilled. Would that actually resolve the ache? Or would it simply generate a new set of questions, a new round of interpretation, a new place for the mind to keep working? Often, when people who did receive the closure conversation, they longed for honest about it afterward. The relief is smaller and shorter, lived than they expected. The explanation rarely turns out to be the key that unlocks peace. Peace, it turns out, was never actually behind that particular door. Here is a reframe worth sitting with, even though it will likely meet some resistance. The first several times you consider it closure may not be information you receive. It may be a decision you make about what the information you already have means for your life. This is not an argument against honest conversations. Sometimes they help, sometimes they're worth having if the opportunity exists, and there's no need to pretend otherwise. But there is a meaningful difference between being open to a conversation if it happens and making your own peace conditional on it happening. The first is healthy. The second quietly hands control of your emotional life to someone who has already demonstrated, by leaving, that they are not going to manage it as carefully as you would. You likely already know more than you're allowing yourself to fully register. You know how it ended. You know roughly why, even if the full explanation was never spoken aloud in the specific words you wanted to hear. The unanswered message, the missing explanation, these are real gaps, and it's fair to wish they weren't there. But you are allowed to decide, on your own authority, what the information you already have is going to mean for your life going forward. You do not need a permission slip from the person who left in order to start living again. Waiting for one is not patience. It is postponement, dressed up as patience, and it can go on for a very long time if you let it. There is a final, quieter form attachment sometimes takes, and it can persist even after most of the obvious symptoms. The checking, the replaying, the composing of unsent messages have started to fade. It's the attempt to manage the other person's choices from a distance. Not to win them back, necessarily, but to control how the story ends, at least in the version that exists in their mind, or in the minds of the people who know you both. You may find yourself wanting to correct their version of events, wanting them to understand what actually happened, to see it the way you see it, to acknowledge the parts they got wrong. You may want them to regret it, not out of cruelty, but because their regret would feel like proof that you mattered as much as you believed you did. You may feel an urge to prove your value somehow, through how well you're doing now, through who sees you moving on gracefully, through some quiet performance aimed at an audience of one. Here is the Stoic move, and it is genuinely one of the harder ones in this entire audiobook, because it asks you to release something that feels, in the moment, like justice. Let them misunderstand you. Let them choose differently than you would have chosen. Let them leave, fully, without a campaign on your part to change their mind. Let them live with their own decision. Whatever consequences it does or doesn't bring them, that is genuinely no longer your responsibility to manage. Let them become someone you no longer recognize, if that's the direction their life takes. Let them carry a different story about what happened between you than the one you carry. You do not have shared custody of the truth, and you are not required to reach agreement before you're allowed to move forward. Let them remember you, in whatever way they end up remembering you. You do not have to correct every interpretation. You do not have to win the breakup, whatever that would even mean. You do not have to prove your value to someone who, by their own choice, is no longer in a position to properly evaluate it. You do not have to make them regret losing you. And even if you did make that happen, it would not restore anything. It would simply be one more outcome you'd have to hope for and wait on, tethered once again to someone else's inner life instead of your own. Your life cannot depend on someone else's realization. If it does, you have handed them not just the past, but the future too. And they are very unlikely to manage that responsibility as carefully as you would, mostly because they are living their own life, thinking about their own concerns, most of which, whether this is comfortable to hear or not, no longer involve you nearly as much as your mind imagines. This is the last piece of the person you're releasing, not the version who hurt you, not the version you loved, but the version who still, in your imagination, owes you a reaction. Letting go of them means letting go of that debt too, real or imagined. It was never actually collectible. Let's pause here, because we've now covered enough ground to say something plainly that has been building underneath everything so far. You do not always need to stop loving someone in order to let them go. You may simply need to stop asking your love to change reality. Read that again, because it quietly overturns an assumption most people carry into grief without ever examining it. The assumption that letting go and loving someone are opposites. That moving forward requires, at some point, an internal switch that turns the love off. That switch does not exist, and searching for it is part of what keeps people stuck, because they're waiting for a feeling that isn't coming, using its absence as proof that they haven't healed yet. The goal was never emotional amnesia. It was never about scrubbing the relationship clean of meaning, or convincing yourself it didn't matter, or becoming a slightly colder version of yourself as some kind of protective armor. The goal, all along, has been something more specific and considerably harder to fake: love without possession, memory without captivity, grief without self-abandonment, care without control. Each of those 4 phrases deserves a moment of its own, because each one names a different piece of what you're actually working toward. Love without possession means you can continue to hold real affection for who this person was to you, without that affection requiring their return, their regret, or their continued presence in your life in order to remain valid. Memory without captivity means the past can visit, a song, a street, an anniversary, without pulling you back inside it every time, without becoming a place you disappear into for hours or days. Grief without self-abandonment means you can feel the full weight of the loss without using it as a reason to stop taking care of yourself. Stop showing up for your own life. Stop being kind to yourself in the meantime. And care without control means you can genuinely wish this person well. Hope their life goes okay. Hope they find what they're looking for, without needing any of that to happen in a particular way, or on a particular timeline, or with you anywhere inside the picture. This is the shape of what we've been building toward, piece by piece, and it's also the shape of everything still ahead of us. we're going to spend the rest of this audiobook exploring what that actually looks like in practice. Not as a single dramatic transformation, but as something built slowly, through repetition, through small and often unremarkable choices made one at a time, on ordinary days that don't feel like turning points while you're living through them. Let's look closely at a specific, extremely common pattern of thought, because almost everyone grieving a relationship spends significant time inside it, often without recognizing what it's actually doing. What if I had called? What if I had stayed? What if I had been more patient that one time, instead of reacting the way I did? What if they come back? What if I never find someone like them again? What if that was my only chance at this? What if they were, in fact, the one, and I've just lost the one chance I was ever going to get? Notice how differently these questions feel from ordinary curiosity. They don't arrive seeking information. They arrive seeking relief, and they promise a kind of relief that thinking cannot actually deliver, because the thing they're asking about no longer exists to be changed. Why does the mind love this particular loop so much, given how little it actually offers? Because the past feels more tolerable when we can imagine it was still controllable. When there's a version, however remote, in which a different choice led to a different outcome. This is comforting in a narrow, specific way. It protects against the harder truth, which is that the past is now completely finished, entirely beyond influence, permanently sealed against revision no matter how many times it gets replayed. The question, what if, starts out, usually, as something close to reflection, a genuine, useful attempt to learn something from what happened. But somewhere along the way, for most people, it quietly turns into something else, not, what can I learn from this? But, how do I escape what already happened? Those are very different projects, even though they can feel, from the inside, almost identical in the moment. The Stoic response draws a firm, useful line between them. The past can be examined, carefully, honestly, even repeatedly. If there is something genuinely still to learn from it, it cannot be edited. No amount of replaying the conversation changes what was actually said. No number of imagined alternate choices alters what you actually chose, or what they actually chose, on the days that mattered. The purpose of reflection is learning, extracting something useful you can carry forward. It is not negotiation with history, and history, notably, does not negotiate back. Here's a practical way to use this distinction the next time a what if arrives. Ask yourself, honestly, is this thought trying to teach me something I can actually use going forward? A pattern to watch for, a way I want to communicate differently next time, a boundary I want to hold more firmly. Or is it simply trying to reopen a door that's already closed, hoping that enough pressure will somehow make it open again? If it's the first kind, sit with it, extract the lesson, and let the thought complete itself. If it's the second kind, and it usually is, you can notice it, name it quietly as a familiar visitor, and let it pass without following it all the way down. Not through force, just through recognition. You don't have to fight a thought to stop being controlled by it. You only have to see it clearly enough to stop mistaking it for something it isn't. There is a sentence that shows up constantly in grief like this, said so often it starts to feel like a complete explanation in itself. I miss them. It feels total, all-encompassing, as though it names the entire problem in 3 words. But it's worth slowing down and taking that sentence apart, because it usually isn't one feeling. It's several compressed together, and they don't all call for the same response. You may miss their presence, simply having someone there, a body in the room, a warmth beside you at night. You may miss their voice, specifically the sound of it, independent of what it was saying. You may miss the routine that had built up around them, the texts at a certain time of day, the plans for the weekend, the small shared rituals that gave your days a shape you've since lost. You may miss the familiarity, not needing to explain yourself, being known without having to perform being known. You may miss the version of yourself you were around them, perhaps more confident, more playful, more at ease than you feel on your own right now. You may miss the future you had imagined, in as much detail as you'd allowed yourself to imagine it. You may miss the feeling of being chosen, specifically, out of everyone available to them. You may miss the certainty of having someone, not this someone in particular, but simply not being alone in the way you are now. You may miss the excitement, especially if the relationship was new enough that it hadn't yet settled into its ordinary rhythms. You may miss the physical closeness. You may miss the emotional safety if it was genuinely there. You may miss the possibility, everything the relationship might still have become if it had continued. You may miss the memories themselves, the specific, textured moments that now feel sealed off, no longer being added to. And you may miss the identity that had quietly attached itself to the relationship, being someone's partner, being part of a we, rather than simply yourself alone again. This is not an exercise in precision for its own sake. It matters practically, because different griefs call for different responses. If what you're actually missing is the routine, that can be rebuilt, slowly, with new shapes, new rituals, without needing this specific person to rebuild it with. If what you're missing is the version of yourself you were around them, that version was never actually theirs to hold on to for you. It was always you, and it's available to you again, independent of them, even if it doesn't feel that way yet. If what you're missing is simply not being alone, that's worth naming honestly too, because it points toward a need. Connection, companionship, that doesn't actually require this one specific person in order to eventually be met. Sometimes you cannot let go of someone because you have not yet identified what exactly you are afraid to lose. The grief stays vague, and vague grief is much harder to work with than specific grief, because you can't address something you haven't named, naming it, even imperfectly, even if the list above doesn't map perfectly onto your own experience, starts to turn something formless and overwhelming into something you can actually work with, piece by piece, rather than facing all at once as a single, undifferentiated wave. Everything so far has been about seeing clearly, understanding the mechanisms, understanding the distinctions, understanding what is and isn't within your control. That understanding matters, but on its own, it isn't quite enough. The Stoics were never satisfied with philosophy as pure theory. They treated it as training, something practiced daily, the way an athlete trains a body rather than simply reading about athletics. So let's turn now toward practice. Specific, concrete things you can actually do, starting today imperfectly, and repeated over time. Begin by writing down what is actually known versus what is imagined. Take a page, draw a line down the middle. On one side, write only what you know to be true. Things that were said, actions that were taken, facts you could defend to a skeptical stranger. On the other side, write the interpretations, the assumptions, the stories you've built on top of those facts. Most people, doing this honestly for the first time, are startled by how much of their certainty lives on the imagined side of the page. Practice separating facts from interpretations more generally, in the moment, as thoughts arrive. When a painful thought shows up, they never really loved me. I'll never find this again. Pause and ask, is this a fact? Or is this an interpretation dressed up as one? Interpretations can be useful, but only once they're recognized as interpretations, open to being wrong, rather than treated as settled truth. Identify what is controllable today, not this week, not this year, just today. What is one thing, small and concrete, that is genuinely within your power to do or not do in the next 24 hours? Often it's smaller than people expect, not checking a certain profile, replying to a friend's message, going for a walk instead of lying in bed replaying a conversation. Reduce unnecessary digital exposure. This one sounds simple and is genuinely difficult in practice, but it matters more than almost anything else on this list. Every photo you keep visible, every profile you keep checking, every notification you leave enabled is a small, repeated invitation back into the story you're trying to close. This isn't about pretending the person never existed. It's about not actively feeding the wound while it's trying to heal. Stop deliberate checking behaviors. And notice the word deliberate. There's a difference between accidentally seeing something and actively going looking for it. The second one is worth catching, gently, each time, and choosing differently. Even when the urge is strong, it gets easier with repetition, not because the urge disappears, but because you build evidence, over time, that you can feel the urge and not act on it. Allow memories without turning them into instructions, a memory arriving on its own, triggered by a song, a smell, an anniversary, is not the same as deliberately going looking for pain. Let it visit, feel it, and then notice if it's trying to instruct you towards some action, texting them, checking their page, reopening a conversation, and if so, let the memory stay while declining the instruction. Write an honest account of the relationship rather than an idealized version. The exercise we touched on earlier, made concrete, not to punish the person, not to convince yourself it was worthless, but to have, in your own handwriting, a full and accurate record you can return to whenever idealization starts to creep back in. Practice saying, out loud if it helps, or simply internally, I wish it were different, but it is not. This sentence does something quietly important. It holds both truths at once, the wish and the acceptance, without asking you to abandon either one. You don't have to stop wishing in order to accept. You just have to stop demanding that the wish come true before you're willing to keep living. Use a pause before contacting someone emotionally. If the urge to reach out arrives, don't necessarily fight it in the moment. Just delay it. 24 hours, if you can manage it. Most of the time, the urgency that made the message feel necessary at 11 at night has faded considerably by the next afternoon, and you'll be glad you waited. Redirect attention toward present responsibilities, not as distraction or avoidance, but because attention that isn't actively needed for processing grief is attention that's available for your actual life, and your actual life is still, in fact, happening. Rebuild routines that disappeared with the relationship. If certain rituals belong to the two of you specifically, consider building new ones, even small ones, that belong only to you. This isn't about replacing what was lost. It's about not leaving that space permanently empty, waiting. Reconnect with friends and ordinary life, even when it feels like effort, even when part of you would rather stay home and think. Isolation tends to amplify attachment because it removes the other relationships and experiences that would otherwise put this one loss in its proper proportion. Learn to tolerate moments of loneliness without immediately escaping them, not because loneliness is good, but because the instinct to escape it immediately, every single time, through checking, through scrolling, through reaching out, is exactly what keeps the attachment active. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is simply sit with the discomfort for 10 minutes without fixing it and notice that you survive it. Allow grief to exist without turning grief into a reason to return. Feeling sad tonight does not mean the decision was wrong, and it does not mean you need to reverse it. Grief and rightness are not opposites. You can grieve something correctly ended. Practice gratitude for what was without demanding that it continue. This is different from toxic positivity, which insists you feel good about the ending. It's simpler of allowing yourself to be genuinely thankful certain moments happened. while fully accepting that they're now over. Build a life that does not require the past to change in order to be good. This is, in many ways, the whole point of everything on this list. Not a life built around waiting for the story to resolve differently, but a life built on the ground as it actually is. None of this works as a single application. These are not instant cures, and treating them as such will only set you up for disappointment when the ache returns the next day or the next week, as it likely will. What they are instead is a set of repeated small choices, practiced imperfectly, again and again, the way any skill is built. Some days you'll do all of them well. Other days you'll check the profile anyway, send the message anyway, lie awake anyway. That's not failure. That's simply what practice looks like. For anyone, in anything worth learning, it's worth pausing to be precise about language, because the wrong words, even said kindly, can do real damage to someone already in pain. This is not asking you to just move on. That phrase, however well-intentioned, treats healing as a single decisive act, a door you walk through once. It rarely works that way. Instead, move forward, while allowing the past to remain part of your story. Not erased, not denied, simply no longer the chapter you're currently living in. This is not asking you to forget them. Forgetting is neither possible nor necessary, and chasing it usually backfires, since deliberately trying not to think about something tends to guarantee you think about it more. Instead, remember, when memory arrives, without reopening the wound every single time it does. This is not telling you that you never needed them, or that the relationship never really mattered, or that you were always secretly fine without it. Those are comforting lies people sometimes tell themselves to survive the early weeks, and they rarely hold up once the initial adrenaline of the breakup fades. Instead, you can acknowledge, fully and honestly, that they mattered, while also recognizing that your future does not depend on them. And this is not asking you to stop caring, as though caring were the problem to be solved. Instead, stop giving another person's choices ownership over your inner life. You can care about someone's well-being genuinely, while no longer allowing your own peace to rise and fall based on what they do, say, or decide on any given day. Each of these distinctions matters because the alternative, the blunter, harsher version of the advice, tends to produce shame rather than healing. If you're told to just move on and you can't, you conclude something is wrong with you. If you're told you never needed them, and you still feel their absence sharply, you conclude you're grieving wrong. The gentler, more accurate versions leave room for what's actually happening, a real, ongoing, imperfect process, not a single clean event you either succeed or fail at. There is a common expectation, rarely stated outright, but held by almost everyone going through something like this, that letting go will eventually arrive as a moment, a morning where you wake up and simply feel different. A conversation, a realization, a specific turning point you'll be able to name later. The way you name an anniversary. For most people, it doesn't happen that way. Maybe letting go is not a dramatic moment at all. Maybe it happens through hundreds of tiny decisions, most of them so small they barely register as decisions at all. You don't check. Just this once, and then the next time, and then the time after that. You don't reread the old messages, even though you know exactly which thread you'd open, if you allowed yourself to. You don't invent another reason to contact them. The borrowed item you don't actually need back yet. The question you don't actually need answered right now. You don't rehearse the conversation again, the one where you finally say the perfect thing. You don't ask mutual friends for updates, even when the curiosity is sharp enough to feel almost unbearable. You don't build your day around whether they might appear, might reach out, might show up somewhere you'll both be. You notice the memory when it comes. You feel it fully, without flinching away from it. And you continue. That is not indifference. It can look like indifference from the outside, and it might even feel like indifference the first several times you do it, because it lacks the drama that grief sometimes convinces us is proof of love. But it isn't indifference. It is freedom being practiced, quietly, unglamorously, one small, unremarkable choice at a time, on days that don't feel significant while you're living through them, and that only looks significant in retrospect, months later, when you notice you haven't checked in weeks and didn't even realize you'd stopped. There is a shift that starts to happen somewhere in this process, usually gradually, rarely announced, where the questions begin to change shape. Instead of asking about them, will they text? Do they regret it? Are they with someone else? What are they thinking right now? A different set of questions starts to surface, quieter but more useful. Who are you when you are no longer waiting for something external to complete your day? Who are you when your phone is not, even unconsciously, a source of hope every time it lights up? Who are you when your mood is not being set, hour to hour, by someone else's behavior, someone else's silence, someone else's choices? Who are you when you stop measuring your own worth by whether someone chooses you? These are not rhetorical questions meant to sting. They're genuinely worth sitting with, because attachment, especially prolonged attachment, has a way of consuming attention almost completely, and attention, it's worth remembering, is not a small resource. Attention is, in a very real sense, life itself. It's where your hours actually go, regardless of what your calendar says you're doing. Every hour spent monitoring someone else, checking, wondering, composing unsent messages, running alternate timelines, is an hour not invested in your own existence. This isn't meant as guilt. You couldn't have skipped this stage, and you shouldn't have tried to force yourself through it faster than you were ready for. But it is worth naming honestly, because naming it is what allows the shift to actually happen. Letting go, seen this way, is not only about losing something. It is about reclaiming something. Reclaiming attention that had been quietly outsourced to someone no longer in a position to use it well. Reclaiming time that had been spent rehearsing a story instead of living one. Reclaiming an identity that had, understandably, organized itself around being chosen by this particular person, and that now gets to reorganize itself around something sturdier. Your own values, your own choices, your own sense of who you're becoming, independent of anyone else's participation. This reclamation doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't happen in a straight line. There will be days it feels complete, and days it feels like it never started. But each small choice, not checking, not rehearsing, redirecting attention back toward your own life, is a small act of reclamation, and those add up, almost invisibly, into something that eventually looks, from a distance, like a person who has genuinely moved forward. Here is an idea worth building toward carefully, because it can sound contradictory until you actually live inside it for a while. You can be grateful that someone existed in your life. You can love what they meant to you, genuinely, without qualification. You can remember beautiful moments, exactly as beautiful as they were, without needing to diminish them to make the ending easier to bear. You can acknowledge that they changed you. Your sense of what you want, what you'll accept, who you are capable of being with another person, in ways that will likely stay with you long after the specific memories of them have softened, and you can, in the very same breath, say, "You are no longer part of the life I am building." These two things do not contradict each other, even though it can feel, especially early on, like they should, like loving someone and releasing them are somehow opposing forces, and choosing one means betraying the other. They aren't opposing. This is what mature attachment actually looks like, as opposed to the version most of us are taught to expect. It is not, "I never cared." That sentence is usually a defense, a way of protecting yourself from the vulnerability of having genuinely loved someone who is no longer choosing you. It's understandable, but it isn't true, and living inside a sentence you know isn't true tends to keep you stuck rather than freeing you. It is, instead, I cared, and I can still continue. Both halves matter equally. The first half honors what was real. The second half refuses to let what was real become a life sentence. Together, they describe something the Stoics understood well, but rarely had quite the right vocabulary to name in these exact terms. A way of loving that doesn't require possession in order to remain genuine, and a way of continuing that doesn't require forgetting in order to be complete. There is one final distinction worth making as clearly as possible, because it may be the single most important refrain in this entire audiobook. And it's easy to miss if you've been listening passively, rather than actually sitting with what's being said. The opposite of attachment is not detachment, it is acceptance. These sound similar. They are not. Detachment says, in effect, I don't care. It's a withdrawal, a numbing, a decision, conscious or not, to stop feeling in order to stop hurting. It is often mistaken for strength, and it can look like strength from the outside, but it tends to cost something significant, a general dulling. Not just toward this one loss, but toward feeling itself, which rarely stays contained to just the painful parts of life. Acceptance says something entirely different. It says, care, and I accept that I cannot control the outcome. Notice that acceptance doesn't ask you to stop caring at all. It asks you to stop insisting that caring entitles you to a particular result. You can care as much as you ever did, more, even, now that the caring is no longer entangled with strategy, with hope for a specific outcome, with the exhausting project of trying to influence someone who has already made their choice. This distinction matters because it changes what you're actually aiming for. If you've been trying to detach, to convince yourself you don't care, to numb the feeling, to prove to yourself and everyone around you that this didn't really affect you, you may have been aiming at the wrong target entirely and wondering why it never quite works, why some small residue of caring always seems to leak through no matter how hard you try to seal it off. You don't need to become colder. You never did. What you need is to become less dependent on reality, matching your preferred version of the story. A subtle shift, but an enormous one in practice, because it allows you to keep your full capacity to feel, to love, to care deeply about people and outcomes, while no longer requiring the universe to arrange itself according to your wishes before you're willing to be at peace. This is, in the end, what the Stoics were actually teaching underneath all the discipline and the famous composure that gets attributed to them. Not coldness, not suppression, a very specific, very demanding, very achievable form of freedom, the capacity to care completely about things you cannot control, without handing those things the power to determine whether you're allowed to be at peace. Let's return one more time to the central question this entire audiobook has been circling from the beginning, because by now you have enough context to actually sit with it honestly, rather than answering it too quickly. What are you asking reality to give you before you allow yourself to be at peace? Is it an apology? A specific admission that they were wrong and you were right? Is it a message, some form of contact, even a small one, that would prove you're still on their mind? Is it a return, the relationship itself restored, as though the ending could be undone? Is it an explanation, the missing piece that would finally make the whole story make sense? Is it a different ending altogether? Not this one, but some other kind of version of how things concluded. Is it a recognition of your value, proof, from them specifically, that you mattered as much as you gave? Is it a guarantee that you will find someone else, someday, so that this loss doesn't feel like it cost you your only chance? Is it a promise, even an unspoken one, that you did not waste your time, that the years or months you gave to this were not, in the end, given for nothing. Sit with whichever of these lands the hardest, because that's likely the actual condition your mind has quietly attached to your own peace, the toll it's been demanding reality pay before it will let you rest. Now ask the harder question, the one this entire audiobook has been building toward. What happens if peace does not have to wait for any of those things? Not because you'll never get them. You might, someday, receive one or more of them unexpectedly, and that's fine if it happens. But what if none of them are actually required? What if the apology never comes, and you're still allowed to be at peace? What if there's never a satisfying explanation, and you're still allowed to be at peace? What if they never fully understand what they meant to you, or what losing them cost you, and you're still allowed, starting today, not someday, not once they finally come around, to be at peace? That is not a small permission to grant yourself. It may be the entire permission this whole audiobook has been trying to offer. Before we close, it's worth naming a few specific situations plainly, because attachment doesn't always look the same, and it helps to see your own particular version of it reflected back clearly, rather than only in the abstract. Someone lying awake after a breakup, staring at a ceiling that has become unfamiliar territory at this hour, running the same 3 minutes of conversation on a loop, searching it for a version where it ends differently. If this is you, know that the loop itself is not evidence of anything being wrong with you. It is simply what an unoccupied mind does with unresolved pain at 11 at night. The loop will lose intensity, not because you force it to, but because you keep gently declining to follow it all the way down, night after night, until it has less and less pull. Someone checking, repeatedly, whether an ex has viewed something they posted, a small act that takes 2 seconds and produces almost nothing, and yet gets repeated dozens of times a day. This is uncertainty doing what uncertainty always does, keeping the mind tethered to the last place it had real information, hoping the next check will finally deliver something conclusive. It rarely does. The checking isn't really about the information. It's about the hope that this time will be different. Someone rereading old messages, scrolling back through months of conversation, looking for something, a clue about when it started going wrong, or, just as often, evidence that it was once real and good, as if that evidence were somehow in danger of disappearing. It isn't. What was real remains real, whether or not you reread it tonight. Someone hoping for a birthday message that may or may not come. Watching the day pass with one eye on the phone and feeling the specific, private disappointment of a day ending without it, or the equally complicated relief and unease of receiving it and not knowing what to do with the hope it reopens. Someone who was ghosted, left with no explanation, forced to construct their own ending because no one offered one. A particularly difficult version of this experience because the unfinished story has nowhere natural to rest, and closure has to be self-generated rather than received. Someone who still loves a person who has clearly, visibly moved on, watching, sometimes involuntarily, as that person builds a new life, a new relationship, a new version of the future that no longer includes them. This is one of the harder scenarios, because it removes the possibility fantasy almost entirely, replacing it with concrete, painful evidence. And yet, painful as it is, it often accelerates healing precisely because it does. The mind can only sustain a fantasy for so long against direct contradicting evidence. Someone who ended the relationship themselves, on their own judgment, for reasons they still believe were right, and who still, against their own logic, misses the person deeply. This confuses people, because they expect the one who leaves to be spared this particular grief. But ending a relationship correctly and grieving it fully are not contradictory. You can be sure you made the right decision and still feel its cost. Someone watching someone they love build a life without them, from a distance, unable to look away entirely. Someone who keeps imagining the conversation they wish they'd had. The one where everything that went unsaid finally gets said, and somehow, in the imagining, resolves itself. Someone waiting for an apology that may never come, measuring each day partly by whether it arrives. Someone who cannot stop asking, what if, turning the same handful of alternate timelines over and over, each one slightly different, none of them real. Someone who knows intellectually that the relationship was unhealthy, genuinely, demonstrably unhealthy, not just difficult, and still misses the good parts, the specific moments that were real even inside something that, overall, was not good for them. This is one of the more disorienting forms of grief, because it comes with a layer of self-doubt. How can I miss something I know was bad for me? The answer is simply that relationships are rarely uniform. Something can be net harmful and still contain real, specific moments worth missing. Both things are true at once, and someone who isn't entirely sure whether they miss the person, specifically, or simply miss who they were when they were with them. A version of themselves that felt more confident, more alive, more located, somehow, than the version currently sitting with this grief. This is worth examining honestly, because if it's the second one, the good news, quietly, is that version of you was never actually theirs to hold. It was always yours. It's still available to you, independent of them, even if it currently feels out of reach. If you recognized yourself in any of these, you are not uniquely stuck, and you are not behind some schedule everyone else seems to be following. These are simply the common shapes this particular kind of pain tends to take. Naming them plainly, out loud or simply in your own mind, tends to loosen their grip slightly, not because naming something solves it, but because it moves it from something formless and overwhelming into something recognizable, something you can actually work with, using everything we've walked through so far. Let's go back to where we started. The hardest person to let go of may be the person who is already gone. That contradiction opened this entire audiobook, and by now, I hope it makes a different kind of sense than it did at the beginning. Not because the ache has been explained away. It hasn't, and it probably shouldn't be, not entirely, not yet, but because you now have language for something that used to feel like it had none. Perhaps letting go was never about deleting them from your memory. That was never actually the task, no matter how many times it's been described that way. Perhaps it was about ending the argument with reality, the quiet, exhausting, largely unconscious campaign to make the past have gone differently, to make another person's choices other than they were, to make an ending softer than it actually was. The relationship happened. The love happened, whatever became of it since. The memories happened, and they remain yours unconditionally, regardless of how things concluded. The disappointment happened too, and it's allowed to sit alongside the good, without cancelling it out. The ending happened. All of that is now fact, sealed, no longer available for negotiation, however much a part of you might wish otherwise. And now there is another fact, quieter, but no less real. Your life is still happening. You can miss them, and still move. You can love them, and still release them. You can wish it had been different, and still accept, fully, that it wasn't. You can remember what was beautiful without pretending the relationship is still alive somewhere, waiting for you to return to it. You can grieve what you lost without sacrificing everything that remains. Your friendships, your work, your ordinary days, your capacity for whatever comes next. So let's ask the Stoic question one final time, plainly, the way it deserves to be asked. What is actually yours? Not their feelings. Those were never yours to manage, however much energy you spent trying. Not their choices, past, present, or future. Not their future, whatever shape it takes, with or without you anywhere in it, not their interpretation of you, or of what happened between you, or of who was right, not whether they return someday, having realized something, not whether they regret leaving, whether that regret ever finds words, or ever reaches you if it does. What is yours? Your attention, where it goes, moment to moment, starting now. Your judgment, the meaning you assign to what happened, which is entirely within your authority to decide, regardless of what anyone else believes. Your choices, what you do next, today and tomorrow, and the day after that. Your actions, the small, repeated, unglamorous ones that eventually add up to a life. The meaning you give the experience, not a meaning imposed on you from outside, but one you get to construct, honestly, in your own time, and the life you build afterward, which remains, entirely, unconditionally, still yours to build. You don't have to stop loving someone to stop waiting for them. Those were never actually the same requirement, however much it felt that way in the beginning. You don't have to erase the past to stop living inside it. You're allowed to keep it, fully, as something that happened to you, rather than something you still inhabit. You don't have to make the ending beautiful in order to make the next chapter meaningful. Some endings are simply what they are, unresolved and imperfect, and the next chapter doesn't need the last one's permission to matter. Sometimes letting go is simply this. You stop asking the past to become the future. You stop asking another person to give you permission to continue, because that permission was never actually theirs to grant. You stop confusing memory with obligation. The fact that you remember someone does not obligate you to keep waiting for them. You stop treating absence as a command to wait, when it was never a command at all, only a fact, one among many, that you get to decide what to do with. And one day, not on a schedule you can predict, not on a date you can circle on a calendar, but one day, arriving quietly, the way most real change tends to arrive. The memory is still there. It doesn't disappear, and it was never going to. But it no longer controls the direction of your life. It becomes something you carry, rather than something that carries you. They can remain part of your story without remaining the destination. You can honor what was without refusing what is, and you can love someone deeply, genuinely, without reservation, without needing to diminish it in hindsight to make yourself feel better, without abandoning yourself to the fact that they are gone. That is the whole lesson in the end, said as plainly as it can be said. Not a command to feel less, not a demand to move faster than you're ready to move. Just this, offered quietly, the way the Stoics themselves tended to offer their hardest truths. You were allowed to love them completely, and you are allowed, starting now, to stop waiting for reality to become something other than what it already is.